This whole thing came about because of a holiday that the researcher on the programme, Max Leonard, took in 2005, where he was in Cuba and he came across a book in a bookshop that referred to there being over 600 attempts against Fidel Castro's life. And he brought the book back and we started having a look at the story, and the very idea that it could be this many was very strange and seemed worthy of looking into in itself. But what really made us feel like the story was worth telling now were two things, really. Firstly, that the attempts on Castro's life went on far, far longer than I was certainly aware of, and I think most people would be aware of. The most recent attempts are in this century. There's one very well documented in the year 2000. Secondly, a lot of this story involves not only the use of illegal violence via attempts to assassinate Castro, but terrorism. And this is a story of terrorism that's closely involved the United States, not as a direct sponsor, but certainly an indirect relationship with people who were using terrorism as a political weapon. And in an era which is our current era, defined by a war on terrorism, to point to America's very heavy involvement with people who were using terrorism seemed like an important story to tell. The allegation that there's quite this many plots comes directly from Fabian Escalante, the former head of Cuban intelligence, and his colleagues, and we're certainly completely satisfied that they have gone through and counted very meticulously every attempt known to Cuban intelligence from 1959 to roughly the year 2000. Not each of those is necessarily a fully fledged attempt. Many of them are plots that were either foiled or came to nothing, but certainly they weren't fabricated. And the more we ask people who are involved on the other side, in Miami, more involved in perpetrating assassination attempts against Castro than preventing them, they tended to check out. And in fact, we came across quite a number of plots that weren't known to Fabian Escalante and Cuban intelligence. So it may be there's an even greater number than 638. It could be the final number is 500, 800, we don't quite know, but it does seem certain that there were a very large number of plots. One of the big things we had to explain in the film is quite how so many attempts on Castro's life could have failed, and it does, on the face of it, sound absurd that over 600 attempts could all have come to nothing. But the more you got into the story, the more you realise how it does make sense in many ways that this could be the case. If you look, for example, at the CIA, the period when the CIA were very closely involved in trying to kill Castro themselves or hire people to kill Castro, they could never do it directly. They always needed plausible deniability. They never. It's much easier to murder someone and get caught than it is to murder someone and get away with it. And the CIA were always looking for rather elaborate means to go about it, because it wasn't going to be politically acceptable in any way for America's hand to be seen. So probably if they hadn't cared about getting caught, they could have done it. That wasn't the case. The second major reason why a lot of plots failed is that the Cuban exiles, who were mainly involved in trying to do this, had a number of failures of courage, and in a final analysis several of them weren't willing to throw their lives away. Certainly many people got close enough to do it, but not close enough to do it and get away with it. And there's something quite interesting about possibly Cuban culture or a love of life that there is, that nobody was willing to take the final step of saying, I don't care if I get killed, I'll do it anyway. The third reason is that Cuban intelligence are very good at what they do. Cuban society is the kind of society in which spy networks operate fairly easily. There's an awful lot of central control. They would have had an awful lot of informants, and they were very dedicated people as far as we could see. Certainly the ones we met, absolutely committed to the cause, and they're acknowledged generally to be an effective bunch of spies, if you like. The fourth reason that was often mentioned to us, and one may not want to take this entirely seriously, but it's certainly something you hear often in Cuba, is that Castro was almost from the beginning protected by white magic. There's a thing called Santeria, syncretic religion in Cuba, which is a kind of a meld between a traditional voodoo type religion and Christianity, very widely practiced in Cuba and allowed by the state, which essentially practices of this religion will tell you with absolute seriousness that Castro was protected by the positive spells that were cast over him by priests of the Santeria religion.
Esas son horas en ceremonia. Ya, pásalo para ahí. Allí.
Sí. Chumbeleque y balaye, alaroye y balaye. 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 Y bambalan kio 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 lona. Y bambalan kio 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 lona.
We know an awful lot more than we'd normally know about CIA activities in the early 60s because of a Senate investigation that took place about 10 years later in the mid-70s, which led to the Church Report. And the Church Report detailed the most extraordinary number of assassination attempts by the CIA against Castro and against other foreign leaders. So we know for sure the CIA was involved in this at that period. After, say, around the mid-60s, we know much, much less, and you've got a far more normal situation of there being a lot of allegations about what the CIA are up to, but no very hard evidence, no concrete proof. Assassinations were made illegal, assassinations of foreign leaders by US agencies were made illegal after the Church Report. You'd expect that certainly in that period, certainly under President Carter, there probably wouldn't have been US president-sanctioned attempts on Castro's life. On the other hand, Cuban intelligence alleges that the CIA's involvement in this goes way beyond that. And frankly, if that was the case, we wouldn't necessarily know. When you're filming in Cuba, you're very aware that this story is tremendously useful as propaganda for the Cuban government, and Castro frequently refers to important figures in our film, like Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch, in his speeches, along the lines that American-sponsored terrorists are out to get us, and it allows Castro to portray himself continually, over decades in fact, as as a victim of American-sponsored illegal violence. There are posters of Luis Posada Carriles around Havana, a very, very large one just outside the US interest section, more or less comparing Luis Posada and George W. Bush to Adolf Hitler. So this is tremendous kind of propaganda material for the Cuban government, and in a way our task was to tell the story without using it in anything like that way, and clearly the tone of what we've tried to do is very, very, very different from the way that the Cuban administration would present it. We tried quite hard to interview Fidel Castro, and sometimes we weren't quite sure why, because we weren't sure that he was going to be the best person to speak about assassination attempts against him. In a way, he was always at one remove, and the way these plots worked, they didn't usually result in a bullet flying past Fidel Castro's ear. They were stymied before it ever got to that stage. But we did try, and like many journalists before us, we went through a rigmarole of being told day after day that you'll get it tonight, and you sit with your equipment ready at 4 o'clock in the morning, but you're told there's the most likely time, because then it's at that point that Castro's more or less kind of finished his business for the day and turns to requests for interviews.